When President Biden released his administration's national security strategy, he declared that, quote, the post-Cold War era is definitively over and a competition is underway between major powers. It's that acknowledgement that was, in part, behind the $95 billion aid bill Biden signed Wednesday, sending money to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, three nations fighting off threats from three of those major powers Biden warned about a year and a half ago. A former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, explained to us Wednesday that U.S. support is coming in a package because the conflicts are too.
It's so clear now, John, the degree to which this axis of aggressors are aiding and abetting each other. With material support, the drones and the missiles that Iran is providing to Russia, Russia is in turn providing all kinds of support for Iran. And then, of course, China's in the act, too.
And David Sanger joins me now. He is the author of the now New York Times best-selling book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. David, it's good to be with you. Before we get to the present, I want to talk about the past, as you outlined so well in your book. You write about how Western governments, especially America, consistently underestimated or misunderstood the intentions of China. Explain that a little bit. Was it lack of information, naivete, or something else?
You know, it was a little bit of poor intelligence, but mostly, I think, John, it was wishful thinking. You know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we saw that Russia was in an unsteady democratization and that China was on the rise. And it was the determined thinking of the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and others. You and I were covering some of this at the time, those White Houses, that China was experimenting with democracy, would join Western institutions. That's why the U.S. guided them into the World Trade Organization. And that over time, it would essentially decide that becoming part of the Western system was more important than territory, more important than worrying about Taiwan, really more important than repressing dissent at a time that we saw a pretty robust, if not fully free press, but independent press underway in China.
Now let's turn to Russia. If you could pinpoint a moment when the miscalculation took place with Putin, where would you put your finger?
You know, I might put my finger, John, of all strange places, on an evening in 2002 when President Bush and Laura Bush and Putin and his then wife were floating down the Neva River outside of St. Petersburg. Bush had gone to get help in counterterrorism. This was shortly after 9/11. And the two were talking about joining the European Union, maybe one day Russia joining NATO, the alliance that had been set up to contain the old Soviet Union. And they were being served dinner, John, by this sort of hulking guy in the background. And when I went back and dug out the pictures, sure enough, it was Prigozhin, the man who later went on to try to fix the 2016 election and start the Wagner Group to go help invade Ukraine.
Now, let's move to the present, this aid package that President Biden just signed. What do you think? Is that a sign that there is now a catch-up in thinking from what you detail at the beginning of your book in terms of an understanding of what the nature of the great power competition is?
I think that catch-up in thinking was going on even in the Trump administration, not necessarily with President Trump, but some of his advisors, including one you just showed, H.R. McMaster, who turned out a national security strategy that tried to steer the United States back toward great power competition, away from eras of counterterrorism. But in the Biden administration, they really crashed into it, John. And, you know, it's Congress, and particularly this group within the Republican Party that wanted to pull back, that seemed to be stepping on the brakes a bit on that. Now, they've come through, and that money will go not only to Ukraine, but to Taiwan. It will go not only to Taiwan, but also to Israel and to the Palestinians. But I think the process was so rough getting there that there are many people wondering whether or not that's repeatable, particularly if a Trump administration comes in.
David Sanger, the author of the New York Times bestseller, New Cold Wars. Thank you so much, David.
Great to be with you, John.